Welcome to Life in the Pit, a podcast about the lives and adventures of instrumentalists within the wonderful world of musical theater. And now, here is your host, David Lane.
Hello, and welcome back to Life in the Pit. It has been a while, but I am glad to be back with you again and glad to present to you another conversation with someone who has had a lot of success in the pit. Well, this is our third new episode of 2025, and it is also the third time that we have brought back a former guest. In this episode, I am talking with Joe LaRocca, who currently lives in the Boston area. I chatted with him a few years ago on this podcast while he was in the midst of the Jesus Christ Superstar 50th anniversary tour, and would definitely encourage you to go check out that episode if you haven't already. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. As a reminder, Joe is a multi-reed player. He plays a lot of woodwind instruments, and he reached out to me because of a lot that he's been going through lately. It's something that has inspired him to start a Substack, a series that he calls A View from the Pit, which, being a podcast called Life in the Pit, I definitely appreciate that theme. And based on some experiences that he's had in the past year or two, he's seen some things that he wants to bring some awareness to, some practices in hiring pit musicians that he thinks would be very good for the industry if we could be aware of it and do something to address it. So I hope that's vague enough that you'll want to keep listening. Let me now share the fascinating conversation that I had with Joe LaRocca. Joe, it's great to talk to you again. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's nice to be back on again after a few years.
Yeah, I caught you in California when you were on the JCS tour, the Jesus Christ Superstar. I believe it was the 50th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah, the 50th anniversary tour that was going around, and that was near the tail end of it. And so I was already starting to have a crisis trying to figure out what I was going to do after that was over.
Right.
But luckily it worked out.
That seems like
well.
a good place to start. What did you do immediately after it was over?
Yeah, and it was an interesting situation because suddenly I was coming back to Boston as a local. I had my girlfriend at the time and I had broken up during tour. And so I had to go back to like my old apartment with her for a while, and then luckily I was able to get a gig playing at Ogunquit Playhouse up in Maine. And so that gave me a little bit of cushion. But the interesting thing is that while I was on the road about a month before we were set to end, I had just started emailing all the contractors in Boston, just letting them know that I existed and that I was going to be available to work. And one got back to me within an hour, who happened to be one of the biggest contractors in town, and was like, basically told me that the biggest producing house in Boston, which is Huntington Theater, was having this show called Bangin' It, which had premiered at La Jolla Playhouse. But they needed someone who could play Bansuri, which I could play kind of well. Like I had in a couple of keys, but they needed in like 19 different keys. You know what I mean? Like all 12 keys plus but one's in different octaves, right? And so I was like, yes, I'll do that. Whatever, Long story short, the show never ended up happening for a multitude of reasons. But that my willingness to do that got me started in Boston, and so I was able to start doing things here and there and was really just hustling. I think in the last 3 years, I played over 30 different shows. Some of them being at, bigger union houses, and then others just being at, high schools and middle schools and stuff, like whatever I could get, because I was just leaving myself open to do whatever gigs there were, which worked out really well near the end of that year because I had gotten this one gig that really started a whole new chapter, which was called the Lehman Trilogy, which was this 3 hour, 45-minute long play where the director and the sound designer wanted an onstage woodwind player specifically, because it was this three-act juggernaut of a play, and they wanted an onstage musician, but they wanted someone who could play multiple instruments. And woodwind doublers are like the best at that. I think I have 12 instruments in my arsenal at the time, and so that worked out really well. And that was an acting contract. And so it really kicked off this whole acting thing for me because there were just people in the process just being like, "Oh, you're kind of a natural at this," and so we ended up re staging it at the Repertory Theater of St. Louis later on that year, and that was they'd used me more, so I had to kind of memorize the whole first act of all the music, and then I was just kind of ingratiated into the movement a lot more. And then there was a show at that was a Huntington stage and Speakeasy stage co-production later that year called The Band's Visit, and and that was one of those things. I was shocked to get a union, theater musician contract because the process was so insular. It's like really hard to kind of make your way in as a kind of at the time it was basically a new person in town. And so but the director had seen me in that play, and so they wanted me in that because the band they were really actor musicians. I mean, I had no lines in that, but they were really including all the musicians into the blocking and stuff. So they even got people from New York for that production who had done the tour and all that stuff because you had specialized instruments like the oud and the darbuka and stuff like that. But then also it was just being on stage and in kind of this, Egyptian police uniform the whole time. So that really kicked things off. And since then I have taken like straight acting gigs, like playing Eddie Carbone in A View from the Bridge, and that was at a community theater, but still pretty competitive process, surprisingly. There's a lot of actors in Boston. But yeah, and then just picking up things here and there that were way more integrated actor musicians type of things. So that really became my new sort of artistic path. All the meanwhile, just trying to take as much work as I could and building up a teaching studio to kind of take the pressure off. But then also, I like teaching, so um,
So were all these gigs in Boston? And I guess the other question is, did you ever try just acting, or were they all actor musician combos?
yeah, everything was in Boston. I mean, out in the greater Boston area. So that meant I worked everywhere from Ogunquit, Maine, down to Providence. You know what I mean? So it's a pretty big area, but here in New England, you could traverse states pretty quickly. But
Right.
and yeah, the acting stuff like the A View from the Bridge, that's just a play. There was no music involved in that. So that was the first time I had ever spoken lines on stage. And I don't know if you're familiar with A View from the Bridge, but it's an Arthur Miller play, and
Mm.
it's hefty. It's a hefty play. And so I came into the audition, and it's at this place called Marblehead Little Theater, which is one of the oldest. I mean, Boston has the oldest of everything, but it was like one of the oldest community theaters in the country. And I had auditioned for it thinking that they would cast me as like immigration officer number two, or like someone with not that many lines, and they ended up casting me in the lead, which had a ton of lines. And my girlfriend also had auditioned for it, and she got cast as my wife in that, who in that play we end up hating each other. So that was kind of serendipitous. They had no idea we were a couple when we auditioned. So that was an incredible process. But yeah, and then that was the only thing I had done that was just straight up acting. And then I'm actually going to be doing a musical with a relatively new company called Treehouse Collective called The Ballad of Little Joe, which I'm going to be in the cast for that. And that again, no instruments involved in that as well. But most of the stuff that I had done was pretty much actor musician stuff. Like I had done one called A Man of No Importance, and this was the same director as The Band's Visit, and so he ended up giving me lines and roles, like several roles to play, but then also having to jump back and play the very hefty woodwind book that had a bunch of tin whistles and flutes on it and stuff. So definitely a combination of both. But now I'm at the point where I'm just taking acting gigs and or just taking auditions and stuff, just to keep my work relatively consistent.
Well, it's always interesting to get the acting perspective. I've done several shows where the band, you know,
members of the band have lines and things like that. Rock of Ages, is a good example of that. Um, but I have twice done Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill, which is basically it's two-person play. It's Billie Holiday and her pianist, and
Right.
had to actually memorize some lines for that. But whenever I felt any pressure on that, I just realized I have 2% of the show's lines. She had 98%.
It is really funny because I'm glad I did a really hefty lead role before I jumped into a character actor role,
Hmm.
because playing a lead role is exponentially easier to get the character down, right? To jump in and just do a couple lines is actually way more difficult. And I think if I would have done a character actor role as an actor musician, because first of all, I mean, like jumping into playing and then doing some lines is also difficult. But then just for anybody to do a couple of lines and embody a character is extraordinarily difficult. And that's why it tends to be kind of specialized. When people can do it, they often have a hard time finding lead roles because everybody wants them to do character actor roles. But anyway, I'm glad I did the lead role first because then it made me way less afraid of going up and doing lines in front of all these equity actors.
Right. So, how has acting impacted your view of theater itself and just your whole perspective?
Yeah, it was very interesting getting a view of like the other side of the table, so to speak,
Hmm.
or just because when we come in as pit musicians, often it's really late in the process, and everybody's already kind of developed their relationships, and if you don't want to talk or interact with anybody, you don't have to usually when it comes to pit gigs, right? Unless it's like really integrated into the artistry of what's happening on the stage, but usually it isn't. They just kind of stick you onto the stage, you come in, you do what you do, and then you go home. Um, but it really taught me a lot of things. Like even in just doing the audition process, it was astounding to me how painstakingly detailed it is. How much they consider everybody's individual artistry, and how much time they take to make sure everybody is not only capable, of course, but also just appropriate for the role. And you see people who are just like fantastic people who get tons of work, who don't end up getting hired for something, and they're just like, oh yeah, yeah, that's just how it goes. It's like constant rejection. I mean, of course the people who are like veterans of it get lots of work, but um you see that it's a very rigorous process. And it just kind of amazed me that it's just not as much of the case with pit musicians, especially in certain theaters. So that really gave me a very interesting view of the way things happen, um, or the
Yeah,
way things can happen, right?
exactly. Uh, as a music director that has been, next to the artistic director in a lot of auditions, I kind of overhear some things. Like I'll give my feedback on someone that I think would be right for the role based on the way they sang. And, the director might be like, he might say something like, yeah, she sings really well, but the height is all wrong compared to the leading man that I want to put her next to. So
Right.
something like that. It could even be, I don't know, just something about the other aspects, the way they deliver lines, that's just different than what they're looking for, and that's one of the problems. Well, I shouldn't say it's not a problem, but it's one of the challenges, of an audition format like that is that a lot of times it does have to do with fit, in that
Hmm.
situation. Uh,
Right.
but speaking of auditions and just kind of equity, your latest passion, I'm not even sure how we transitioned to that, but maybe you can tell us how you got to that point. You have a blog, I think it's called View from the Pit,
That's right. Yeah.
and I took the time this weekend. I read through all of your articles. Just I wanted to see where you were coming from. You have a lot of good stuff there. So your first post was called "Casting the Pit."
Right.
What led to that? What led to starting the blog? And maybe for the benefit of our listeners, define what was your message in that post?
Yeah. So, um, where to start? So basically, where it started was I was just, perusing the internet one day, and I'm a big fan of Catherine Needleman's work. And for those who don't know, she's the oboist of the Baltimore Symphony, and incredibly outspoken about issues relating to sexism in classical music, specifically. And she touches on all types of topics, but that's kind of where she, her thing is. And she, has a massive following on there. And I had just, and a lot of it has to do with classical music. You think about that stuff that's been going on with the New York Philharmonic, and like sexual assault issues and stuff like that. Really big, important issues that are still kind of being swept under the rug by a lot of organizations today. So voices like hers are incredibly important. So I've just been following her work, and I just love her because she's so unabashedly, she's unapologetically harsh, and is willing to name names and just does not care. And she's, she teaches at Curtis, and, plays in the Baltimore Symphony and stuff. It's just like this huge player with everything to lose, but just doesn't care, and it was kind of a, becoming a role model a little bit. And so one post came along where somebody had named, specifically it was some locale, where, she had messaged Catherine just saying like, I'm dealing with sexism myself. I'm a pit musician here. And, look at all these pictures, it's the bulk of these pit orchestras are white men. And, you know, I I then messaged her just being like, I'm a pit musician in Boston, and I can tell you it's very similar here, And frankly, I think one of the reasons I was able to get so much success and so much work as quickly as I did, was because of unconscious bias on the part of a lot of contractors. I mean, not, outright sexism. I mean, we can get on that later because there are examples of that. But I mean, I think it had a lot to do with it. I think it made my life a lot easier. So I just messaged her and said, like, look, I mean, I have the pictures to prove right here. It's the same here. And it wasn't even so much a thing of me being like, oh, post this on your page. It was just kind of, hey, thanks for bringing light to the voice of somebody who's frustrated. Giving somebody a platform who's frustrated to at least get the conversation going, because I think it's a real issue. And so she said, look, if you want to write about your experience, I will share it. And, to her thousands of followers. And I was like, okay. And I started, just mulling it over. And I ended up posting anonymously at first just because I was, terrified. I didn't want to lose work or just, kind of make anybody mad or ruffle any feathers. And so I just made a little thing about just how, how it's undeniable that there's an issue, and that there are tons of talented women and people of color and LGBTQ folks and, historically marginalized groups who are kind of shut out of this process. And even just younger folks who are just trying to come in and do this, having a difficult time because there's really very little transparency, not only in how to submit, but in how to even know what the process is, right? So I wrote about that a little bit and just saw kind of how it went. And then after a while, I just felt this thing build up inside of me as the kind of, frustration mounts, not only because I started talking to people, I just started talking to my colleagues, not only around, Boston, but just around other places, other followers of Catherine and stuff, and just really starting to get frustrated in that there was a common through line all around the country. So I wrote this piece, and I really thought that it would be nothing, like that it's just a Substack. I had no followers, and I just posted it, and then like posted it on Facebook and said like, hey friends, like I am, kind of, and it, this one in terms of language is probably the most expose style and the most, kind of harsh language out of any that I've written. But it exploded. I mean, I think it's since gotten like over 2,500 reads. And I've gotten, I've only got a little over 100 followers now, but it just exploded. And not only that, but it got around the Boston scene pretty big. Like a lot of these old guard players and insiders and contractors were starting to share it with each other. And I knew that because a contractor who is not online ended up calling me, like this first person who like almost hired me when I came back to town, and was just indignant. It's just very angry at me. And I was like, what have I done? And I was horrified. I was so scared. Um, but to go back a little bit, I ended up what I ended up writing about in this was just the fact that in pit hiring, not only is there a lack of transparency in how it happens, like there's no real open submission system. Some contractors have this where they'll have like websites and stuff like that where you can submit to them. But really, for the most part, I mean, in Boston, I can speak to specifically, like in order to know who to submit to in terms of contractors, you have to join the union, start paying dues, go into the member directory, and then find out who the contractors are. And they have a list. Not every city has this, by the way, but Boston just has a contractors list of who you can contact. And when I came to town, and this is the case for a lot of people, like you're just straight up ghosted until they might be interested in you. Again, no transparency in the process of how you're selected or what kind of materials they would want to see or how you could prove yourself. It's really just kind of a word of mouth system, and I think this is the case in most places around the country, where it's like I even heard a contractor responding to Catherine Needleman's post, just saying like your audition is the last gig you played for me, and you get that because somebody recommended you, and saying this as if this is great. Like you heard what you just said, right? It was a major self-report. And so I go on more and more into the article about how the knock-on effect is that this ends up shutting out historically marginalized people, because when it's a word of mouth system, what you're dealing with is unconscious bias. And I really want to drive this home, because in my later pieces, I end up even just putting a full definition of what unconscious bias means, because I don't think people fully understand what it means, right? It means it's unconscious. It means you're sitting there not thinking, because a lot of people, a lot of insiders, whether they're first call players or contractors, will always shoot back with, I've never turned somebody down for being black. I've never turned someone down for being a woman, etc. Right? It's like, I'm not saying you have, but unconsciously you might have. When you're reaching out to somebody who happens to be a white man, right? The likelihood is that their unconscious bias will tend toward the people who they like more, right? And the people who they like more are most likely going to end up being the people who look like you, right? This is what unconscious bias is, right? And this is why theaters and arts organizations all around the country are implementing DEI, right? And again, this is a whole podcast episode on its own, is people's misconceptions about DEI. But really, it's just an effort to, we've had affirmative action in this country, right? Which made it illegal for people to discriminate, to explicitly not hire people based on skin color, based on gender, all of that. That was the first step. And now what we're saying to people is, it's like DEI encourages people to put your thumb on the other end of the scale for a little bit, so that one day it may balance, right? Because the other end of the scale has not been tipped in this country for certain, right? But so that's some of the things that I touch on a little bit as well with that in the piece, right?
Yeah. Now you mentioned already
So
you
yeah.
had someone reach out to you, say that they were indignant.
Mm.
I mean, give us a range of what are some of the responses that you've had from that early work that you've done.
Yeah, thank you for getting me on back on track with that. Well, I mean, first of all, I will say that the support has been 99%. Like the people who agree with me and the people who are shaking their heads, yes, that is a vast plurality of people. Um, I have literally only had one person reach out to me and to disagree with me. Um, and I've had a lot of, only a few people have really sort of loudly agreed with me. The rest are quietly agreeing, right? Whether it be just sending me a Facebook message or, or liking a certain post or something like that, and people who are really, and it's not just people who are frustrated about not getting work. It's people who are getting work, who are people who are embedded in the system, people, leadership in the union, who are agreeing with me. And so I just wanted to preface it with that. But the one person who did disagree with me, who was, an insider in this, full for a long time. Um, yeah, first thing is always like I've never discriminated against anybody, so we've gone over the unconscious bias with that. And then really it was the long and short of it was defending the word of mouth system, and then also going with the scarcity narrative, right? And I think the scarcity narrative has been used historically in all sectors that are dealing with labor or dealing with workers, and saying there's just not enough work, right? And so people are just going to end up being shut out. But the problem with that is that when you're dealing with a system like the first call system, when you have these players who, when you have these contractors who have their system being that they have a list of people, and whatever gig there is, they're just going to call that first call person first and then go down the list, right? The order, we don't know how it's made, but they know how it's made, and it's up to one person, right? So it ends up being that a small number of people, the vast majority of which are at this point in Boston specifically, but frankly all around the country, are older white men. Um, those guys end up getting the vast majority of the work, and then everybody else is kind of left with scraps. Now, and one of the things I had argued, um, about this being a problem is the fact that, there is no way that any one player is the perfect fit for every show that comes along. And I even list examples and told him examples of just complete artistic mismatch, right? Like you're talking, someone who's primarily perhaps a classical oboe player who also plays saxophone being on a very jazz saxophone heavy show, or perhaps a jazz saxophone player being on an only flute show, right? When there's a million flute players out there who are trained to play in symphonies, but that guy happens to be the person who's more closely intertwined with a first call player or is a first call player. So, and but it just wasn't hitting that wasn't okay. You know what I mean? And so I ended up writing a whole piece about just sort of the backlash of from this piece and some of the common arguments, and sort of debunking them one by one. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, the one time I've seen a book, that I could rent for like a community theater that actually took time to even mention that you might want to look for the right fit for a musician. It's Newsies. Newsies actually has a list of all the instruments, and it'll say like this trumpet player should be good with this type of range and this type of sound,
Mm.
and it goes down the list. Somewhere on my phone, like in the thousands of photos, I've still got this the photo I took of the screen of the page. I was literally probably, I'm gonna guess what, at least 6 years ago, maybe seven. Yeah, so it's been a while
Mm.
since I saw that, but still the only time I've seen a licensed material kind of take that into consideration. But yeah, it is the case, and I've tried to, from my end, although I've worked mostly with community theater, tried to be mindful, like when I'm hiring like a bassist, for example. That's like, well, what are their strengths? Is it rock electric bass? Are they good at jazz? Are they good at bowing? And I have a person that I love to use whenever possible, but if it involves bowed bass, they're not my first choice. It's just because
Right.
it's not their strength.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen. I mean, I've been in productions, union productions, where, for instance, this really crazy good jazz bass player can't bow to save his life. It's like just complete out of tune in a union show. And you mentioned community theater, and I want to preface a lot, or throw this out there, the fact that what I'm talking about mostly is union productions, right? And that when you're dealing with, because with community productions and with school productions and with even smaller theater productions, you just got to get who you can get. You can try your best, but um you know and definitely obviously take things into consideration, because musicians will take gigs that are lower paying, and so there's going to be some competitiveness to it. But when it comes to these big union contracts that have just tons of money tied up in them, there just has to be a little bit more there just has to, it's a responsibility of the theaters and the contractors to cast a wider net and allow people to even begin to try to compete, right?
Yeah.
Which just doesn't exist right now in a systematic way, right? And so this is what I'm doing, is trying to encourage, individual theaters and contractors to make a change, because it would just take years and years to have unions make these kinds of changes. But yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to that. So one of your more recent posts, you actually took time to kind of like I'd call it almost like a manifesto of sorts, uh,
Mm.
of what if you were in charge and you could influence kind of theater companies, producers, directors, what you would recommend as far as like to promote more fair and ethical hiring practices for pit musicians. So talk about that.
Yeah, okay, so my first piece was casting the pit, and then in response to people saying like, well, what would you do? Which I touch on in that a little bit, but it was very brief. And so I thought, fine, I'll expand on it completely. That if I were contracting, if I were in charge of it, this is what I would do. And basically, I coalesce it down to two different systems that I feel like theaters could adopt. Either you do a sort of casting system, meaning that it kind of stays up in the air as to who gets hired at any one time, first call out the window. Of course, the veteran players would be heavily, heavily considered because their resume would be stacked, right? That would give them a huge advantage. But what it would do is treat pit hiring more like casting, right? And so for every individual show that comes in, you take into consideration people's strengths and weaknesses and really treat the musician selection, of course, like casting, but then also consider it in the dramaturgy of the show, right? Um, and even going farther, I would say, including them earlier in the process and really, working with the MD to try to encourage, different things like, hey, maybe there's a tenor saxophonist who has or a woodwind doubler who has a tenor saxophone from like the 1920s that would fit more appropriately with this show that is based on the Great Gatsby or something like that, right? This is something we could do. So, the casting system really makes it so, and you have an open submission that's very obvious, right? So where the theater website has in their casting page a section for musicians that says, if you want to submit, here's the contractor's information, that there's no mystery behind it, right? And so you do that, you contact them, whoever submits is considered by the contractor, right? Who then brings his suggestions to perhaps the casting directors and all that stuff. And then, so there's that system. But then I could also drafted the resident system, right? Which is more in line with the first call system. And, if people wanted to make it so that whoever is a first call player has just more transparency and job stability, say, okay, they're a resident musician of the theater, right? The Muni does this. They hired, just a couple of years ago, they opened up an audition for a in-house woodwind player. So whatever shows happen there, which I believe the Muni is a self-producing house. Yeah, so whatever shows they do there, um, that woodwind player would be called, and all the resident musicians would get called first, right? And it's listed on their website who, or at least I don't know about the Muni, but in my system that I was outlining, that it would be listed on the website who are the top call players, right? And so then just like symphony orchestras, all the players who want to sub for them will kind of know who to kiss up to, right? Again, transparency. Because, I kept hearing, and a lot of my colleagues, including myself, kept hearing from contractors when we would, inquire about shows, oh, we just have to respect the first call guys. I'm like, well, who are they? How did they get chosen? And nothing. Just it is the way it is, right?
Yeah.
So those are the two kind of examples I outlined for that, and the ways that theaters can not only implement them, but implement them relatively quickly and cheaply. So yeah.
Have you gotten any feedback on that? Has anybody representing one of those said that is something that we think we're going to try to do, or you think that that stage is in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually did interview for several theaters to take over as contractor myself. Because again, in this whole process, the one thing that people had recommended to me, it was like, well, why don't you try contracting? And I said, oh, okay, that sounds, I mean, I didn't really, I mean, I had thought about it, but the thing is that I'm kind of on the fence about it in certain ways because I would like to do it, but then I also know I wouldn't. One of the things I lauded in my piece is that it's unethical for a contractor to hire themselves as a musician,
Right.
right? Which is something that's been kind of universally accepted everywhere that that's an okay thing to do. But I wouldn't want to do that. And so if I become a contractor at a certain theater, as a player, it'd be kind of sad for me to, take the, be backstage and everything like that. But I also want to make sure that some of these things that I'm recommended are implemented in a concrete way in the real world. And that's the only way I could see that actually happening within a relatively short amount of time. So I've been in talks with a few theaters. A couple of them are union contract theaters, about possibly taking over as contractor there. So that's one way in which, I've been in touch with theaters about this stuff.
Well, this is great. Is there anything else that you want to say on the subject that I haven't asked you about already?
Yeah, no, I think that pretty much covers all of it, honestly. I will say one thing too. I had another piece in there, and this one actually had to do more with the actor side of it than the musician side of it, and the piece was called "Normalizing No: Why Silence Hurts Artists,"
Yeah.
and it definitely has more to do with actors because what actors deal with when it comes to auditions is that they'll do a first round, and if they don't hear anything back, they just kind of assume that they didn't get invited to callbacks, which is fine in certain scenarios because sometimes they just have a general open audition for things where you're kind of being considered for everything. Um, but even with certain like callbacks and stuff like that, you might not hear anything until you just see the cast list, right? So when you're a freelancer, an actor, an artist, I mean, even a musician, I mean, if you're directly inquiring about a certain show and you don't hear back like in a systematic way from a contractor, it's really frustrating and you leave yourself open and maybe turn down gigs both on the actor and musician side. I mean, everywhere, you're turning down gigs for the hope of getting this thing, and then it just doesn't pan out, and you just, a simple no is incredibly effective, is what I'm trying to put out to people with that one. And but just overall, I mean, I just want to encourage musicians to speak out about these frustrations a little bit more, um, and well, and frankly too, I have encountered a lot of musicians who have been speaking out more about these things, and I've actually been I had reached out to a publication called HowlRound Theater Commons,
Mhm.
and they're a publication that's out of Emerson in Boston, and it's really kind of a theater centric publication that is really focuses on social justice in within the theater community. And so I had an outline of an article approved for them, and so now I'm in the process of basically rewriting my Casting the Pit article and the Ultimate Guide to Ethical Pit Hiring article, rewriting it for just a general theater audience so as to encourage, producers and directors and sort of people on the other side of it, in the theater side of it, to really take these issues seriously, especially because within the process of talking to the editor about this piece, one of the things she wanted me to do was find direct quotes from people. And in that search, I realized that this whole thing is a much bigger case of unconscious bias, and really a big case of just pure unethical hiring practices, and then also outright sexism and racism and homophobia that I didn't consider. I had suspicions because, you just hear kind of, old guard players or even just more conservative players really kind of grumbling about wokeism and stuff like that. And, you kind of just take it with a grain of salt, right? But in some of the stories I've heard, particularly from women, Like I had heard one story about somebody who was playing in a pit orchestra, and I'm going to quote her directly in the piece. I won't name her now, but in the piece she will be named and quoted. But she was playing in in a professional pit orchestra in town, and one of the top call players was lamenting about um, a woman getting hired at another theater and just writing it off as just woke shit. And she had complained to the contractor, who then apologized himself, but that player never apologized and continues to get hired regularly. When that kind of speech would not be tolerated in any other part of the theater, but it never made it to HR in the theater because it is such a hands-off process. These are contracted people; they're not employees that have the same rights as others in the theater. But then there was also a situation where there was a player and heavy insider who had basically said that they didn't get hired for a gig as a player because they only wanted to hire black folks there, when it wasn't all black folks in that pit. They just happened to be a better player and more suited to that role, but this person couldn't help but lament about that. And that's just outright racism. Like, I don't care what you have to say about it. um and these were just and these weren't just isolated incidents. I mean, the more and more people I talk to, the more I heard things like, oh yeah, it's uncomfortable, but you just got to deal with it. And then, oh yeah, I've heard stuff like that, but you know people are afraid to speak out about it because frankly they'll get blacklisted. um there are a lot of people who get quietly blacklisted because of this stuff. And then one more example I'll share with you of a person that I'm quoting was a person who was hired at a theater, who was a cello player, who ended up during tech week getting fired and being replaced by a hobbyist celloist who happened to be the general manager of that company. And this person losing out on a bunch of income and having to scramble. They're not going to find work like that close to it. They just had to go home. And happened to be a house where they like how or a theater where they house you and stuff. And so and this person was, this contractor was apologetic about it and gave her another gig. But the fact is that it happened. um and it just totally went unchecked. And but again, these aren't isolated incidents. These are the fact that things like this are allowed to happen, means that there are just systemic issues, right, that need to be addressed, right? I mean, theaters have done a remarkable job of implementing DEI when it comes to the cast, when it comes to the designers, when it comes to literally every other employee in the theater, but it has just not reached the pit. And, and it's not only that, you know, it happens to be a sort of insulated echo chamber of cis het white males, but it's also people who are just allowed and outspoken about being racist and sexist and homophobic. So, um, I just want to encourage musicians to not be afraid, because if we all speak out, they can't fire all of us, can't
Right.
blacklist all of us. And I want to encourage people who are and to encourage musicians that if you have a problem, don't go to your contractor, go to the HR person in the theater, right? If anything like this happens, it cannot be swept under the rug. It has to be something that is out, and the contractor has to be held responsible, and the individuals have to be held responsible. So yeah, as Forrest Gump said, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, yeah, this is a very important conversation. And where can people go to find out, like, all that you've been writing on it, your Substack? Where can people find that? And also, where can people find you, as a musician as well?
Yeah, so my website is bigjoeflute.com, and I have my Substack is also Big Joe Flute. Um, I think I had even put in there like JoJo the Flute Boy at one point, somewhere in the yeah, it's bigjoeflute.substack.com. That's my Substack if you want to read more about it. I'm going to be coming out as soon as I'm done with that Howl Round article, which will take a couple of months. I'm going to be also writing a piece about orchestra hiring, which is going to take a while for me to really dig into because a lot of people have written about that. Um, But then also, for if any theater professionals are listening, if you are interested in any kind of musician consulting and musician hiring consulting, I have a contracting company now called Boston Pit Casting. And that has all the information anybody needs about that. And musicians in the Boston area are also encouraged to submit to my roster to be considered for future work and stuff, and a bunch of different projects that I am kind of currently incubating with relationships with different theater companies and stuff. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I have in terms of my stuff.
Wonderful.
So.
It was great talking to you again. Thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. It was a pleasure.
And that's going to wrap up today's episode. If you've been a longtime listener of Life in the Pit, I just want to go ahead and say thank you so much. If you've missed some of the recent episodes, you may be wondering what exactly is the schedule, the release schedule for Life in the Pit. It used to be weekly, it used to be bi-weekly. Now it seems like I'm not sure when an episode's going to come out. And I've gone over this in some other recent episodes, but to summarize, there currently is no schedule. I don't really know when the next episode's going to come out. For the foreseeable future, the podcast with this episode and all the ones that came before it will become available, will stay available. But I'll be forthcoming that I'm currently not really seeking out guests for this podcast. So if you're a listener and you know somebody who you think would be a good fit for this podcast, and a reminder, a good fit means they do talk about experiences of being in a pit for a theater production from personal experience. If they have other topics, I do have another podcast called Musicianship Mastery, which might be appealing, and I am seeking out guests for that. Now, some platforms such as Spotify don't have all of the very early episodes because I didn't know what I was doing when I first got this podcast started a little over 5 years ago. But if you go to lifeinthepitpod.com, you can find all of the episodes, and I think you can also find them on Apple Podcasts as well. So again, that's going to wrap up today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I don't know when the next time will be, but until next time, thank you once again.